The roar of the crowd echoes through the ancient stone corridors of the Colosseum, a thunderous wave of excitement and bloodlust. Dust swirls in the sunlight as two figures step onto the sand, weapons gleaming. But here's the twist. One of them isn't the burly, muscle-bound warrior you'd expect. She's a woman, a gladiator, and she's about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about the brutal world of ancient combat. For centuries, the stories of these fierce female fighters have been buried, dismissed, or outright ignored. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most deliberately forgotten chapters, the rise and erasure of female gladiators. Picture this: Rome at the height of its power, a society obsessed with spectacle and dominance. Gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were a symbol of control, a way to showcase strength and reinforce social hierarchies. Yet hidden within this hyper-masculine arena were women who shattered expectations, stepping into the arena not as victims or novelties, but as legitimate, skilled combatants. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of a larger, quieter rebellion against the rigid gender roles of their time. So why don't we know their names? Why were their stories systematically erased from the records, their existence reduced to footnotes or outright denied? The answers lie in a tangled web of cultural bias, political fear, and the deliberate reshaping of history by those in power. Over the next few minutes, we'll piece together the fragments they left behind, the rare inscriptions, the hushed whispers in ancient texts, the tantalizing archaeological clues that hint at a truth too explosive for its time. This isn't just a story about gladiators. It's about who gets to decide what history remembers and why some voices are silenced before they can even speak. By the end of this journey, you'll see the Colosseum and the past itself in a whole new light, because history isn't just written by the winners. Sometimes it's rewritten to make sure the rest of us forget there were ever other contenders at all. The idea of women battling in the arena was shocking, even scandalous to many in ancient Rome, but that didn't stop them. Emperor Nero, always one for spectacle, saw an opportunity. In the year 64, he staged lavish games pitting elite women against each other, not as jesters or props, but as serious fighters, and the crowds. They couldn't look away, but these women weren't just imperial playthings. Take the gladiator known as Amazonia, whose name survives on a stone inscription, or Achilia, another fighter immortalized in records. These weren't stage names, they were battle-hardened identities worn with pride. So how did a woman end up in the arena? The paths varied. For some, it was pure survival. Enslaved women with no other options might be forced into the ludus, the brutal training schools where they'd learn to wield a sword or trident under the watchful eyes of hardened trainers. Others, surprisingly, might have chosen this life. In a world where women had few avenues for independence, the arena offered something radical, a shot at glory, even wealth. Win enough battles and you could buy your freedom, or at least earn the kind of fame that made you untouchable. But here's what's fascinating: these women didn't just participate, they excelled. Ancient sources describe female gladiators fighting with the same ferocity and skill as their male counterparts. They trained relentlessly, mastering the gladius and the net, learning to read the crowd as deftly as they dodged blades. And the audience, they loved it. The sheer novelty of women fighting drew gasps, but it was their prowess that earned cheers. This wasn't just about breaking rules, it was about rewriting them. Yet even as these women carved out their place in the arena, the backlash was brewing. Many Roman elites saw them as a threat, not just to tradition, but to the very order of society. If women could fight like men, what else could they do? The existence of female gladiators blurred lines that the powerful preferred to keep stark, and so, slowly but surely, the records grew quieter. Mentions were scrubbed, stories softened, but the truth has a way of resurfacing in a fragment of pottery here, a hastily carved inscription there. These women fought more than just opponents in the sand, they fought against being erased. And in those fleeting traces they left behind, they won. The mosaic in Bodrum tells a story without words. Two women, helmets off, locked in combat, their muscles tensed, their weapons raised. One is labeled Amazonia, the other Achilia. They're not just fighting, they're immortalized. This isn't some crude doodle or satire. It's a snapshot of their reality, preserved in tiny colored tiles. Across the Mediterranean, in Roman London, another clue emerges. A relief carving of a woman gripping a trident and shield, her posture defiant, her identity unmistakable. These aren't accidents or anomalies, they're proof. Then there are the bones. In York, beneath what was once a bustling Roman city, archaeologists uncovered a female skeleton with injuries that tell a violent, purposeful story. Healed fractures consistent with weapon strikes, muscle attachments suggesting years of brutal training. This wasn't a victim of random violence, this was a fighter. And she wasn't alone. Other grave sites hint at women buried with honors typically reserved for gladiators, coins for Charon, the ferryman of the dead, or fragments of expensive armor. These women weren't hidden in life, but in death their stories were nearly lost to time. Why are these discoveries so rare? Because history is a game of survival, and not all evidence makes it through the filter of centuries. Many artifacts were destroyed deliberately, mosaics broken, inscriptions chiseled away. Others were simply overlooked, dismissed as curiosities rather than credible records. Even when female gladiators were depicted, later scholars often explain them away as mythological scenes or comic relief. But the truth is harder to erase than ink on parchment. Every shattered piece we find is a crack in the official narrative, a whisper saying, "We were here." The real question isn't whether female gladiators existed, it's how many. If we've found this much against all odds, how many more stories are buried beneath cities, farms, or even modern parking lots? Each discovery forces us to reimagine the past, not as a static page in a textbook, but as a living, breathing world where women fought literally for their place in history. The sand of the arena may have settled long ago, but the echoes of their defiance, those are still ringing. Roman society had a complicated relationship with female gladiators, equal parts fascination and outrage. To the elite, these women weren't just fighters, they were walking contradictions, defying the very fabric of what it meant to be Roman. Satirists like Juvenal sneered at them, calling their matches unnatural spectacles, framing them as symbols of moral decay. Imagine the scandal, women who are supposed to weave wool and raise children, now standing victorious over fallen opponents, their bloodied swords raised to the cheers of thousands. It wasn't just about combat, it was about power and who was allowed to wield it. But here's the irony, while the aristocracy clutched their pearls, the common people couldn't get enough. The crowds adored female gladiators, packing the stands whenever they appeared. There was something electrifying about seeing women command the arena, their skill undeniable, their presence undeniable. This wasn't just curiosity, it was admiration. The same society that claimed to reject these fighters couldn't look away. That tension tells us everything. Rome loved a spectacle, but only if it could control the narrative, and female gladiators, they refused to be controlled. The backlash was inevitable. By the early 3rd century, Emperor Septimius Severus outright banned women from the arena, citing morality as the reason. But let's be honest, this wasn't about virtue. It was about fear. Female gladiators challenged the idea that strength and glory belonged exclusively to men. If women could excel in the most brutal, hyper-masculine space imaginable, what did that say about the so-called natural order? The ban wasn't just an end to their fights, it was an attempt to erase their legacy before it could inspire others. Sound familiar? This isn't just ancient history, it's a pattern we still see today. Whenever women break into male-dominated spaces, whether in sports, politics, or the military, the pushback follows the same script: mockery, moral panic, then outright exclusion. The Romans didn't invent this playbook, they just wrote one of its earliest chapters. But here's what they couldn't stamp out: the sheer tenacity of those women who stepped into the arena anyway. Their defiance echoes across centuries, a reminder that progress isn't given, it's taken, one hard-fought battle at a time. The absence of female gladiators from history books isn't an accident, it's a calculated silence. Think about who held the pens in ancient Rome. Writers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio were fixated on emperors, senators, and military campaigns. To them, the arena was just a sideshow, a distraction from the real history of political intrigue. And when they did mention gladiators, women were rarely deemed worth the ink. It wasn't just oversight, it was a choice. The stories that survived were the ones the elite deemed important, and female fighters didn't fit their narrative of an orderly, male-dominated world. Then came the Christians. By the 4th century, as Rome's new religious authorities gained power, gladiatorial games were branded as barbaric. But here's the twist: while male gladiators were condemned as symbols of pagan excess, female fighters were erased twice over. Their existence was either ignored or twisted into moral lessons about the dangers of women stepping out of line. A woman wielding a sword wasn't just offensive, it was terrifying. So the records were purged, the stories were written, until these warriors faded into myth. Even when evidence did surface, later scholars refused to see it. Take the 18th century archaeologist who uncovered a relief of 2 female gladiators. He dismissed it as a fantasy scene, insisting real women could never have fought. For centuries, discoveries like these were explained away as artistic license or mistakes. Why? Because admitting their existence would have forced historians to confront the uncomfortable truth. The past was far more complex than their textbooks allowed. This isn't just about gladiators, it's about who controls the narrative. For every woman erased from the arena, think of the countless others: scientists, leaders, artists whose contributions were minimized or attributed to men. History isn't a neutral record, it's a battleground where the victors decide what's remembered. The fragments we have of female gladiators are more than artifacts, they're rebellions. Every mosaic, every inscription is a crack in the facade, proving that even the loudest silences can't drown out the truth forever. Stepping into the Ludus, the gladiator training school, was like entering a world where pain and discipline ruled every moment. Female gladiators didn't get softer treatment. They endured the same grueling drills as the men, swinging heavy wooden swords for hours, their muscles burning under the relentless Mediterranean sun. Trainers pushed them mercilessly because in the arena, hesitation meant death. But here's what's remarkable: these women weren't just keeping up, they were thriving. Ancient sources describe their training as indistinguishable from their male counterparts, building the same explosive strength, the same razor-sharp reflexes. They sparred, they bled, and they earned their place in the sand through sheer force of will. Food was fuel, and their diets reflected that. High-protein meals, beans, barley, even meat, a luxury for most, were carefully rationed to build muscle and endurance. But this wasn't some privileged lifestyle. For every gladiator who gained fame, there were dozens who lived in cramped, filthy barracks, their bodies aching from yesterday's wounds, their futures uncertain. Enslaved fighters had no choice in the matter. Every meal, every drill was a step toward someone else's profit, yet for free women who chose this path. That bowl of lentils wasn't just sustenance, it was a ticket to something rare: autonomy. In a society that denied women ownership of their own bodies, the arena offered a perverse kind of freedom. Win enough battles and you could buy your way out of the ludus, your scars becoming badges of honor rather than marks of shame. But let's not romanticize it. The risks were brutal and ever-present. A misplaced step in training could snap a tendon. A single slip in the arena could mean a spear through the gut. Medical care was primitive at best, and infections claimed as many lives as combat did. Yet even in this unforgiving world, female gladiators found ways to tip the odds. Some specialized in lighter, faster weapons like the dagger or the net, using agility to outmaneuver heavier opponents. Others leaned into the crowd's fascination, turning their novelty into leverage. A fighter who drew cheers could negotiate better treatment, even demand a share of her winnings. The differences between male and female gladiators weren't just physical, they were systemic. While men could rise to celebrity status, women faced an invisible ceiling. No matter how many victories they stacked up, they were never fully seen as equals. Their matches were often scheduled as novelty acts, slotted between the main events like sideshows, and when they won, the rewards were smaller, the respect harder won. But here's what the records don't say. Every time a woman raised her sword in that arena, she was hacking away at the foundations of a system that never wanted her there in the first place. Their victories weren't just personal, they were political. Archaeology tells a story that texts often omit. At a gladiator barracks in Pompeii, researchers found a small room with traces of cosmetics and jewelry, evidence that female fighters lived and trained alongside the men, but carved out spaces to reclaim their identity beyond the blade. These weren't just warriors, they were women who refused to be reduced to a single role. They trained like demons, fought like legends, and in the quiet moments between battles reminded themselves and us that they were human. The arena tried to erase their complexity, but the fragments they left behind scream otherwise. To the senators and aristocrats of Rome, female gladiators weren't just fighters. They were walking contradictions, human manifestations of a world turned upside down. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, where men ruled the battlefield and women were confined to domestic roles, these women wielded swords with the same lethal precision as any soldier. They didn't just challenge expectations, they shattered them, their very presence in the arena a silent rebellion against the so-called natural order. The elite recoiled, not because these women were weak, but because they were dangerously strong. What terrified them wasn't the violence, it was the implication. If a woman could master the art of combat, what else was possible? But to the enslaved, the poor, the invisible masses who packed the Colosseum's cheap seats, these fighters meant something entirely different. Every time a woman raised her sword in defiance, she became a mirror for their own suppressed dreams. For a slave forced into the arena, her victories whispered hope. Even the most broken could rise. For a lower-class woman trapped in poverty, her skill screamed defiance. Talent wasn't bound by birth. These gladiators didn't just fight for themselves, they fought for everyone who'd been told their place was fixed, their fate sealed. The parallels to other warrior women across history are impossible to ignore. From the Celtic queen Boudica, who led armies against Rome itself, to the Dahomey Amazons of West Africa, an all-female military regiment feared across continents. Whenever women take up arms, they're never just soldiers. They become symbols, their battles transcending flesh and blood to strike at the heart of power itself. Rome knew this. That's why female gladiators were tolerated only as novelties at first, then erased entirely when their influence grew too loud. Suppression wasn't just about morality, it was about survival. A society that lets its oppressed see their own strength is a society on borrowed time. So what does their defiance mean for us? Look at any modern movement where women break barriers, sports, politics, science, and you'll see the same pattern. First ridicule, then resistance, then reluctant acceptance. The details change, but the script remains eerily familiar. Female gladiators remind us that progress isn't a straight line. It's a fight, often bloody and always hard one. Their legacy isn't just in the sand of the arena, but in every woman who refuses to stay in her assigned lane. They teach us that history's most dangerous stories aren't the ones written in stone, but the ones that refuse to stay buried. Imperial spectacles were never just entertainment. They were carefully staged political theater, and female gladiators became unexpected pawns in the emperor's games. Take Nero, who reveled in shocking the public. When he paraded high-born women in the arena, it wasn't progress, it was a calculated flex. By flouting tradition, he demonstrated his absolute power to rewrite social rules on a whim. The message was clear. Even Rome's elite daughters weren't beyond his control. Their swords were props in his grand narrative of defiance, a performance designed to cement his reputation as a rule breaker. Then there was Domitian, a master of distraction. Facing growing discontent over his brutal reign, he staged nocturnal battles pitting women against dwarves, a grotesque spectacle meant to dazzle and disorient. The crowds left buzzing about the bizarre show, not the missing senators or empty treasury. This was tyranny disguised as innovation, a smoke screen of sand and blood. Female gladiators under Domitian weren't warriors. They were curiosities, stripped of dignity to feed the emperor's desperation for spectacle. But here's the cruel twist. The moment these women ceased to be useful, they were scrubbed from history. When Nero fell, his innovations were condemned as decadence. When Domitian's corpse was dragged through the streets, his games were recast as moral failures. The very emperors who elevated female gladiators made them disposable. Their existence rewritten as aberrations rather than acknowledgments of women's capability. This pattern isn't unique to Rome. Think of modern regimes that trot out token figures during crises, only to discard them when the spotlight fades. The difference. We have records of Rome's manipulations, fragmentary but damning. A fresco here, a sneering line in Suetonius there. These fragments reveal the truth. Female gladiators were never truly celebrated. They were exploited, then erased, their legacy contingent on the whims of men who saw them as tools, not trailblazers. The arena wasn't just a battleground for flesh and steel, it was a war over narrative. Every time an emperor thrust women into the spotlight, he wasn't challenging norms, he was proving how easily norms could be weaponized. The real fight wasn't between gladiators. It was between the story's power told and the truths it tried to bury. And in that struggle, the sand always settles, but the stains remain. The chains that bound female gladiators to the arena weren't just iron, they were economic, social, and inescapable for most. Slavery wasn't an afterthought in their stories, it was the foundation. Captured in wars, born into servitude, or sold to pay debts, these women entered the ludus as property, their bodies tallied alongside swords and sandals in their owners' ledgers. Every scar, every victory, every breath was someone else's investment. Yet within this brutal system, glimmers of defiance flickered. A skilled fighter could turn her body from a commodity into leverage, bargaining for better treatment, larger food portions, even a cut of her winnings. The line between exploitation and opportunity was razor-thin, and some walked it with terrifying precision. Take the case of an inscription from Ostia, a bustling port city near Rome. It records the death of a female gladiator named Erasure, freedwoman of the Ludus, who fell in combat. That single word of freedwoman speaks volumes. She'd earned her liberty through blood and skill, only to die in the sand moments too late to enjoy it. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The arena offered enslaved women something almost nowhere else did: a sliver of upward mobility. Win enough fights and you might buy your freedom, but at what cost? The price was paid in broken bones, trauma, and the ever-present risk of a blade to the throat before the contract could be sealed. This duality cuts to the heart of their legacy. On one hand, celebrating these women as empowered warriors risks whitewashing the horror of their circumstances. They didn't choose the arena, it was chosen for them. Yet reducing them solely to victims ignores their undeniable agency. Archaeologists have found graves of female gladiators buried with prize money and honorifics, proof that some carved out dignity even in chains. Their resistance wasn't always grand gestures. Sometimes it was simply surviving, training harder, fighting smarter, forcing a system designed to chew them up to spit them out alive. Compare their plight to other enslaved athletes in history, like the charioteers of Constantinople or the boxing slaves of 18th century Jamaica. In each case, the enslaved leveraged rare talent into tenuous freedom, their bodies both their prison and their passport. But female gladiators faced an added layer of oppression: gender. A male gladiator who won his freedom might retire as a coach or bodyguard. A woman, her options were grim prostitution, domestic labor, or returning to the arena out of sheer necessity. The door to liberty swung both ways, and the hinges were rusted with inequality. Modern parallels haunt us, from trafficked fighters in underground rings to college athletes generating millions while barred from sponsorships. The commodification of bodies, especially marginalized ones, isn't ancient history. What changes is the packaging. Female gladiators remind us that resilience under oppression isn't the same as liberation. Honoring their strength means acknowledging the chains they bore, not airbrushing them away. Their legacy isn't a tidy lesson about triumph. It's a messy, aching question. How do you hold space for both the brilliance of their skill and the brutality of the system that demanded it? The sand of the arena holds no easy answers, only echoes. From the battlefields of feudal Japan to the misty hills of ancient Britain, warrior women have left their mark across cultures, but none walked quite the same tightrope as Rome's female gladiators. Consider the honor musha, the noble women samurai who commanded respect in armor, their swords blessed by shoguns, or Boudica, the Celtic queen who united tribes against Rome itself, her name etched into history as a symbol of resistance. These women fought with honor, often with the full backing of their societies, but the women of the arena, they had no royal blood, no divine mandate. They were slaves, outcasts, even volunteers who stepped into a system built to chew them up and spit them out. What makes Rome's female gladiators so extraordinary isn't just that they fought, it's where they fought. The Colosseum wasn't a battlefield, it was a stage, a place where violence was packaged as entertainment for the masses. Unlike the Valkyries of Norse myth or the Amazons of Greek legend, these women weren't abstract symbols of feminine power. They were flesh and blood, their existence confirmed by broken bones and chiseled inscriptions. Their stories weren't sung by poets, they were scrawled in the margins, whispered in taverns, then systematically scrubbed from the record. So why the disparity? Why do some cultures elevate warrior women while others bury them? Look at the context. Societies like the Celts or the Dahomey Amazons of West Africa integrated women into warfare out of necessity. Small populations meant every able body was needed. Their stories became legend because they served a purpose, inspiration in times of war. But Rome, it was an empire drowning in manpower, obsessed with hierarchy. Female gladiators didn't bolster the ranks, they undermined the very idea of male supremacy. A woman winning glory in the sand wasn't just unexpected, it was subversive. The contrast reveals an uncomfortable truth. Societies celebrate warrior women when it serves them, and silence them when it doesn't. Joan of Arc became a saint only after she was burned at the stake. The Trung sisters of Vietnam are hailed as national heroes, but only after centuries of being dismissed as rebels. Rome's female gladiators never got that redemption. Their legacy wasn't polished into patriotism, it was buried under layers of shame and denial. Yet here's what endures: the sheer improbability of their existence. They weren't queens leading armies or goddesses wielding magic swords. They were real women enslaved, impoverished, or desperate who stared down a system designed to erase them and said, "Watch me." That's why their fragmented stories matter more than any myth. Legends are safe. These women were dangerous. Christianity's rise didn't just change Rome's religion, it reshaped its memory. By the 4th century, the church had branded gladiatorial games as barbaric relics of a pagan past, and the arena's blood-stained sand became a battleground for souls. But this wasn't just about ending violence, it was about controlling the narrative. Female gladiators, already clinging to the margins of history, were erased with particular zeal. Church fathers like Tertullian thundered against the unnatural spectacle of women fighting, framing them not as athletes, but as moral contagions. Their very existence was twisted into a cautionary tale, proof of Rome's decadence rather than its complexity. The irony: many early Christian martyrs had died in those same arenas, lions tearing at their flesh as crowds roared. But where male martyrs were venerated as saints, female fighters were scrubbed from the record. Their stories didn't fit the new archetype of pious, passive womanhood the church promoted. A woman with a sword was suddenly more threatening dead than alive, her legacy rewritten to serve a dogma that demanded her silence. This wasn't unique to Rome. Across history, ideological shifts have acted like cultural bulldozers, burying traditions that didn't align with the new order. Think of the burning of Maya codices by Spanish missionaries, or the Soviet Union's suppression of folk music as bourgeois decadence. Each purge follows the same pattern: first condemnation, then erasure, then the quiet fabrication of a cleaner, simpler past. The gladiatorial games didn't just fade away, they were actively dismantled. Their rubble used to build a myth of Christian Rome as a moral utopia rather than a transformed empire. What makes the loss of female gladiators so haunting is the selectivity of it. Male fighters were remembered, albeit as symbols of paganism's brutality. But women, their absence wasn't an accident, it was policy. The church couldn't risk leaving behind evidence that women had ever been anything other than submissive. Every mosaic broken, every inscription defaced, was a stitch in the shroud meant to smother their memory. Yet traces linger. In a 9th century monastery in Switzerland, a scribe copying ancient texts paused to sketch a crude margin doodle: two figures with swords, their hair long, their bodies unmistakably female. Was it a joke, a slip of the pen, or a quiet act of preservation, a flicker of truth escaping the censors? The church won the battle over Rome's legacy, but history, like the women who fought in the arena, refuses to stay down forever. In the damp basements of 19th century museums, curators labeled artifacts with dismissive scrawls, a probably mythological or satirical piece, when faced with evidence of female gladiators. A bronze statuette of a woman holding a sword must be a goddess, a mosaic of two helmeted fighters with distinctly feminine features, surely an allegory. The scholars of the time couldn't or wouldn't accept that these women had been real. Their blind spot wasn't a lack of evidence, it was the weight of centuries of assumption. Archaeology, like history, has always been a mirror reflecting the biases of those holding the trowel. Then came the 20th century's quiet revolution, feminist historiography. Researchers like Kathleen Coleman and Alison Futrell began asking different questions, peeling back layers of interpretation to reveal what had been there all along. Suddenly, that goddess statuette was re-examined. Her pose wasn't divine, but tactical, her grip identical to gladiator reliefs in Pompeii, the mosaic. Carbon dating placed it squarely in the 1st century, its craftsmanship too expensive for mere parody. These weren't anomalies, they were receipts. The past hadn't changed, our willingness to see it had. Every breakthrough forced a reckoning. In 2008, DNA analysis of a gladiator grave in London confirmed the remains belonged to a woman, her bones bearing telltale training injuries. The discovery made headlines, but the real story was the pushback. Some historians still insisted she must have been a camp follower, a spectator, anything but what the evidence screamed, a fighter. It's a pattern we've seen before. When Mary Leakey uncovered the Litoli footprints, proving early hominids walked upright, male colleagues initially credited her husband. Progress isn't just about finding the truth, it's about surviving the resistance to it. What's thrilling and unsettling is how much we're still uncovering. Ground-penetrating radar in Turkey recently revealed an arena where female gladiators likely fought, its seating inscriptions listing women's names alongside men's. Meanwhile, linguists re-examining Latin graffiti found slang terms like gladiatrix, long dismissed as jokes, now looking eerily consistent across dozens of sites. The puzzle pieces were there, we just needed the right lens to assemble them. This isn't just about rewriting history books, it's about confronting why certain stories were suppressed in the first place. When we label something impossible, we're often revealing more about our own limits than the past's. The same biases that buried female gladiators have erased countless others, scientists, leaders, artists whose contributions were ignored because they didn't fit the dominant narrative. Each time we correct the record, we're not just learning about antiquity, we're questioning who gets to define what's normal in our own era. The lesson here isn't that history is unreliable. It's that history is alive. Every shard of pottery, every faded inscription is a conversation, one we're only now learning to hear in full. What else waits in the shadows of our assumptions? If female gladiators could vanish for millennia, what other truths are we walking past, blindfolded by our own expectations? The sand of the arena has settled, but the excavation of our understanding has barely begun. Hollywood loves the roar of the Colosseum, the clashing swords, the cheering crowds, the sweat-drenched heroes. But there's one glaring omission in these epic spectacles: the women who fought just as fiercely as the men. Films like Gladiator paint the arena as an exclusively masculine domain, where the only women are weeping spectators or love interests. Even when female fighters do appear, think of the scantily clad warriors in Spartacus. Blood and sand, they're framed as exotic novelties, their armor designed more for male gaze than historical accuracy. This isn't just creative license, it's a modern echo of ancient erasure. The pattern runs deeper than costuming. Take Pompeii, where a female gladiator is introduced only to be killed off minutes later, her existence reduced to a plot device for the male protagonist's motivation. Or The Arena, a 70s exploitation flick that leans into titillation rather than authenticity. These portrayals don't just overlook history, they reinforce the same biases that buried these women in the first place. By stripping female gladiators of their skill and agency, pop culture turns them into footnotes, just as Roman chroniclers did. But why does this matter? Because the stories we consume shape how we understand the past. When blockbusters erase female fighters, they tacitly endorse the idea that combat, glory, and power have always been male domain. It's a feedback loop. Audiences see no women in ancient battles, so they assume there were none, which makes filmmakers less likely to include them. The cycle of amnesia spins on. Yet cracks are forming in this glossy facade. Recent shows like Domina and Barbarians hint at a shift, depicting women who wield influence and weapons with nuance. Even video games like Assassin's Creed, Odyssey let players step into the sandals of female mercenaries, their strength unapologetically front and center. These aren't perfect portrayals, but they're steps toward balance. The real challenge isn't just adding women to the arena, it's respecting their complexity. Female gladiators weren't monolithic. Some were enslaved, fighting for survival. Others were aristocrats chasing adrenaline. Some reveled in the spotlight, others loathed it. Reducing them to sexy sidekicks or tragic martyrs does them the same injustice as pretending they didn't exist. Demanding better isn't about political correctness, it's about historical honesty. Imagine a Gladiator sequel where the hero trains alongside a woman whose skill matches his own, her backstory as richly drawn as his. Imagine a 300-style epic where the Spartan queen isn't just a voice of caution but a strategist in her own right. These stories wouldn't just entertain, they'd correct the record. The sand of the arena has settled, but the battle for memory rages on. Every time we uncritically accept an all-male ancient world, we let history's gatekeepers win. The real rebellion, insisting that our popcorn flicks like our textbooks leave space for the women who refuse to stay in the shadows. After all, if we can believe in Russell Crowe's Maximus, why not Achilia, whose name still echoes on that ancient mosaic? Fiction has the power to erase, but it also has the power to restore. The next time Hollywood shouts, "Are you not entertained?" let's answer, "Not until you show us the whole story." 2,000 years may separate the Colosseum from the octagon, but the echoes of history are impossible to ignore. When Amanda Nunes steps into the cage or Clarissa Shields raises her gloves, they're walking the same tightrope as Achilia and Amazonia, celebrated for their skill, yet constantly forced to justify their right to be there. The arena's sand has been replaced with canvas mats, the stone seats with pay-per-view screens, but the underlying script remains eerily familiar. Women who excel in combat sports today don't just fight opponents, they battle stereotypes that would have been recognizable to any gladiatrix. Listen to the language used around female athletes, and you'll hear Rome's ghost whispering. When Ronda Rousey dominated early UFC matches, critics dismissed her as a novelty. Olympic boxers like Nicola Adams face constant questions about ruining their femininity. Even Serena Williams, arguably the greatest athlete of any gender, endured years of commentary fixated on her physique rather than her prowess. These aren't just isolated incidents, they're modern iterations of the same moral panic that saw Emperor Septimius Severus ban female gladiators for corrupting public morals. The players have changed, but the playbook hasn't. Yet there's a crucial difference: visibility. Roman female fighters left behind fragments, a mosaic here, a bone there. Today's athletes broadcast their defiance in real time. When MMA fighter Zhang Weili trains in viral videos, her punches shattering pads with terrifying precision, she's not just preparing for a match, she's overwriting centuries of erased history. Social media has become their Colosseum, where every highlight reel and interview chips away at the old narrative. the crowd no longer gets to look away. Progress isn't linear, though. For every milestone, like the first women's boxing matches at the 2012 Olympics, there's backlash waiting in the comments section. Female athletes face online harassment at rates dwarfing their male counterparts, their inboxes flooded with threats and objectification. The jeers that once echoed through stone arenas now trend on Twitter. But here's what's changed. The women have microphones now. When UFC champion Valentina Shevchenko claps back at trolls, or when soccer star Megan Rapinoe uses her platform to call out inequality, they're wielding a weapon their ancient predecessors never had: the power to rewrite the narrative in real time. The most telling parallel isn't in the struggles, it's in the strategy. Just as female gladiators specialized in agile, technical styles to overcome larger opponents, modern fighters innovate to claim their space. Kayla Harrison dominates judo before transitioning to MMA, her technique trumping brute strength. Wrestler Helen Maruli stuns the world by defeating a Japanese legend not with power, but with precision honed through thousands of hours drilling counters. These women aren't just participating in their sports, they're reinventing them, forcing the world to expand its definition of what a fighter looks like. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of Rome's forgotten warriors lies in the quiet moments before the cameras roll. When a young girl watches Liz Carmouche, the first openly gay UFC fighter, hoist a championship belt, she's seeing something the ancient Ludus never allowed: a future. The sand may have settled, but the fight continues, not for survival this time, but for something even more revolutionary: normalcy. The true victory won't come when women win titles, but when them doing so stops being remarkable. That's the finish line Achilia never reached, the one today's gladiators are sprinting toward with every punch, takedown, and defiant interview. The arena's walls have fallen, but the echoes of their footsteps still shake the ground. The armor of female gladiators wasn't just protection, it was a statement. Unlike the heavy, full-coverage suits worn by some male fighters, their gear often featured surprising adaptations. Mosaics and frescoes show women in tunics tied at the waist, midriffs exposed, or in lightweight breastplates that left their arms free. At first glance, modern eyes might dismiss this as ancient fanservice, but the reality was far more strategic. That bare abdomen wasn't about seduction, it was about survival. In the suffocating heat of the arena, where every ounce of weight and every restricted movement could mean death, mobility trumped modesty. These women weren't dressing for the male gaze, they were engineering their gear for life or death efficiency. Yet practicality wasn't the only consideration. The arena was theater as much as combat, and every gladiator, male or female, was a performer. Their armor had to balance defense with drama. Take the Murmillo, a fighter class often depicted with a fish-crested helmet and single greave. When women adopted this style, they added subtle flourishes, thinner waist plates that allowed for acrobatic dodges, or embroidered straps that caught the light as they pivoted. These weren't frivolous details, they were calculated choices to heighten spectacle without sacrificing function. A fighter who dazzled the crowd could earn the referee's favor, or even a merciful thumbs up if she stumbled. The most revealing clue lies in what they didn't wear. Unlike Hollywood's chainmail bikinis, real female gladiators avoided anything that would compromise their center of gravity. No dangling belts, no flowing capes, just streamlined gear that mirrored their combat style. Archaeologists studying gladiator graves note that women's armor often showed wear patterns suggesting repeated upward slashes, hinting at a preference for agile, high-angle strikes. Their clothing wasn't just fabric, it was data. Every stitch and strap tells us how they moved, fought, and outmaneuvered opponents who likely outweighed them. But here's where it gets fascinating. Their gear also became a canvas for identity. enslaved fighters had little control over their lives except sometimes their armor. A recovered greave from Pompeii bears a scratched inscription, Victrix, or She Who Conquers, not the owner's mark of the ludus but a personal declaration. Another artifact, a leather wrist guard, shows delicate tooling of a serpent, a symbol of regeneration in Roman culture. These weren't standard issue, they were quiet rebellions, a way to claim individuality in a system designed to erase it. The parallels to modern athletes are striking. Today's female fighters customize their gear to think Serena Williams' bold catsuits or the UFC's relaxed uniform policies allowing personal sponsorships. Like their ancient counterparts, they navigate a line between performance and persona, using their kits to assert control in spaces that haven't always welcomed them. The difference: today's women have social media to explain their choices. Achilia and Amazonia never got that chance. We're left deciphering their intentions through fragments, reading resilience in the frayed edges of a belt or the strategic cut of a tunic. What survives is a testament to ingenuity. These women took the limited materials they were given and hacked them into something that served both body and spirit. Their armor wasn't just metal and leather, it was a manifesto. Every modification whispers the same truth. They weren't just surviving the arena, they were mastering it. History remembers Domitian's so-called Battle of the Amazons as a spectacle, an emperor's decadent whim, where women fought under the glow of torchlight, their matches framed as mythical reenactments. But peel back the layers of imperial propaganda, and something far more fascinating emerges. These weren't just costumed performers, they were elite fighters, their clashes meticulously choreographed to appear savage while masking the precision of years of training. The crowd may have come for the fantasy, but they stayed for the skill. And though the records reduce these events to footnotes, the whispers that survive suggest some of these women became legends in their own right. Take the duel between two fighters known only as Achilia and Amazonia, immortalized in that Bodrum mosaic. The artwork shows them mid-combat, helmets discarded, their faces locked in fierce concentration. What's striking isn't just their presence, it's the details. The mosaics captured the tension in their stances, the way Amazonia's shield angles to deflect Achillia's strike. This wasn't a caricature, it was a portrait. These women had reputations so enduring that someone paid to have their likenesses preserved in stone. In a world where most gladiators vanished into obscurity, their names survived. That's no accident, yet for every Achilia, there were dozens whose stories slipped through the cracks. Consider the unnamed woman described in a passing line by the poet Martial, who fought a draw so thrilling the crowd demanded her freedom only for history to forget her the moment she stepped out of the arena. Or the Syrian fighter whose epitaph proudly declared she'd bested 12 opponents, her grave marked with a carving of her victorious pose. These fragments hint at a reality where female gladiators weren't just novelties, they were celebrities, their exploits gossiped about in taverns and marketplaces long after the sand settled. The silence of the sources isn't proof of their absence, it's evidence of a deliberate erasure. Roman historians were far more interested in emperors and senators than arena fighters, and female gladiators threatened the narrative of a neatly ordered society. But the outliers that slipped through the graffiti scrawled on a Pompeii wall praising a woman's unmatched speed. The cursed tablet found in Carthage invoking a female gladiator's name for luck tell a different story. These women weren't just fighting for survival, they were etching themselves into the cultural consciousness, one bloody victory at a time. What's heartbreaking is how close we come to knowing them. A papyrus fragment from Egypt lists payments to a troop of gladiators, including a woman whose earnings matched the men's. A recovered playbill from Ostia advertises a matchup between the viper and the lioness. their nicknames suggesting personas as carefully crafted as any modern athlete's brand. These weren't anonymous combatants, they were professionals with followings, their careers cut short not by lack of talent, but by the tides of politics and prejudice. The real tragedy isn't that female gladiators faded from history, it's that they were never supposed to be remembered at all. Every mosaic, every scrap of graffiti, every sneering mention in a moralist's rant is a defiance, a crack in the facade. They fought in an arena designed to consume them, and yet against all odds they left scars, not just on their opponents, but on time itself. The gladiatorial schools of Rome operated on a brutal but brilliant business model: turn human bodies into profit, and few investments drew crowds like a female fighter. Promoters knew the sight of women clashing swords sent murmurs rippling through the stands, not just for shock value, but for the sheer rarity of it. Ticket sales spiked when they appeared on the playbills, and shrewd Lannisters, the owners of gladiator troops, capitalized on that curiosity, marketing their female combatants with nicknames like the Panther or Venus of the Blade to stoke anticipation. But behind the spectacle lay a surprising economic reality. Some of these women may have pocketed a cut of the profits. In a world where women couldn't vote, own property, or even control their own dowries without male oversight, the arena offered something radical: a paycheck. Enslaved fighters might earn meager sums, but free women who volunteered could negotiate contracts, taking home a share of their winnings or appearance fees. Archaeologists have found lead tokens in Pompeii believed to be gladiator payment tallies, with a handful bearing feminine names. One inscription from Ostia mentions a freedwoman gladiator who donated a small fortune to a local temple, her wealth likely amassed through years of combat. For women with few paths to financial independence, the sand of the arena became an unlikely ladder. Yet this economic agency came with a dark trade-off. The same novelty that fattened promoters' purses also made female gladiators disposable. Once the crowds grew bored, or moral outrage boiled over, their careers were cut short. Emperor Septimius Severus didn't ban women from the arena because they lacked skill. He did it because their presence had stopped turning a profit. The backlash from traditionalists outweighed the box office draw, and just like that, their livelihoods vanished. The Lannisters moved on, repurposing their marketing for dwarf battles or exotic animal hunts, while the women who'd fought for gold found themselves erased twice over from the workforce and from history. The ledger books tell a silent story of exploitation masked as opportunity. A papyrus from Egypt records a troop owner paying a female gladiator half what her male counterpart earned for the same match, despite her equal billing. Another contract, etched on a broken tablet, stipulates that a volunteer fighter's earnings would be withheld if she disgraced the games, a vague clause that likely allowed promoters to cheat her out of pay. Profit dictated every facet of their careers, from the armor designed to accentuate their femininity, lighter, more revealing gear saved on material costs, to the matchups engineered for maximum drama. These women weren't just athletes, they were commodities, their bodies leveraged for entertainment until the margins dried up. What's haunting is how little has changed. Modern female athletes still fight for equal pay in sports like soccer or tennis, their matches often scheduled as undercards to men's events. The Roman arena's business model: exploit novelty, then discard it, echoes in every viral sensation chewed up by the algorithm and spat out once the clicks fade. The difference: today's gladiators have unions and social media to push back. Achilia and her peers had only their wits and the fleeting hope that the crowd's cheers might translate to coins in their palms. Their economic power was as fragile as the parchment recording their triumphs, easily burned, buried, or rewritten by those who profited from their silence. Roman law's silence on female gladiators speaks volumes. The few surviving edicts that mention them, like Emperor Septimius Severus's ban in the early 3rd century, don't describe them as athletes or even people. They're framed as problems to be solved, disruptions to be quashed. This legal invisibility wasn't an oversight, it was a strategy. By refusing to define their status, Rome ensured these women existed in a gray zone, vulnerable to exploitation without the protections granted to male gladiators. Were they slaves, contracted performers, criminals condemned to the arena? The law deliberately kept the answer murky, leaving their fates at the mercy of whoever owned or promoted them. Consider the stark contrast with their male counterparts. Male gladiators, even enslaved ones, had codified rights, limits on how often they could fight, medical care between matches, even paths to freedom. Their contracts, etched into bronze or stone, survive in fragments across the empire, but for women, not a single legal document confirms their terms of service. The absence is deafening. It's as if Rome wanted their labor the ticket sales, the spectacle, without admitting they were part of the system at all. This ambiguity bled into every aspect of their lives. Male gladiators who won their freedom could become trainers or bodyguards. For women, manumission often led to dead ends. Without legal recognition as athletes, they couldn't join guilds or secure stable work. Some likely vanished into the underclass, their skills useless outside the arena. Others might have been forced into prostitution, their hard-won freedom just another kind of cage. The law's silence wasn't neutral, it was a trapdoor beneath their feet. Even in death, the discrimination held. Male gladiators were frequently buried in communal tombs with markers listing their records and achievements. Female fighters, their graves, when found at all, are often unmarked or shoved to the margins of cemeteries. A rare exception, a 1st century tomb in Turkey, bears the inscription, "Here lies Hermes' daughter, a gladiator who never yielded." The fact that it stands out as an anomaly tells us everything. Rome's legal system didn't just fail these women, it conspired to erase them twice, first from the record books, then from memory. Yet the very laws meant to suppress them betray their presence. Severus's ban didn't target a handful of outliers, it addressed a phenomenon widespread enough to threaten the social order. Legal archives may omit them, but the panic in those edicts screams the truth. Female gladiators weren't just a fringe curiosity. They were a movement Rome couldn't ignore and couldn't bring itself to name. Behind every gladiator, male or female, stood a patron, wealthy Romans who financed their training, equipment, and appearances in the arena. These benefactors weren't just silent backers, they were puppet masters pulling strings from the shadows. For female fighters, this relationship was especially fraught. A patron might shower his gladiatrix with fine armor, a private trainer, even promises of freedom, but at what cost? The line between sponsor and owner blurred dangerously, especially for enslaved women who had no say in the deals made over their heads. Take the case of Eumatia, a wealthy businesswoman from Pompeii, whose name appears on an inscription alongside a female gladiator's victory record. Was she a rare female patron, genuinely invested in her fighter's success? Or was this merely another venture in her portfolio, a calculated investment in the bloodsport economy? The inscription doesn't say, but the ambiguity itself is telling. Patronage wasn't charity, it was transactional. Every coin spent on a fighter was an advertisement for the patron's wealth and influence. And when the fighter in question was a woman, the spectacle and the stakes doubled. Some patrons reveled in the notoriety. Emperor Nero famously paraded his female gladiators at private parties, their combat skills showcased like exotic pets. But others took a more hands-on role. Archaeologists have uncovered villas with private training grounds, where elite Romans like the senator Decimus Laelius might watch his fighters spar over dinner, offering critiques between courses. For these men, a skilled gladiatrix wasn't just entertainment. She was a status symbol, proof of their discerning eye for talent. The better she fought, the more his reputation grew. Yet this mentorship often masked a darker truth. No matter how celebrated, she remained property. The power imbalance was stark. A patron could withdraw support on a whim, leaving a fighter to rot in the ludus's lower ranks. Contracts for those few free women who had them were riddled with loopholes. One papyrus from Alexandria reveals a patron deducting a female gladiator's earnings for unladylike conduct, a vague charge that likely meant refusing his advances. Even manumission, the ultimate prize, came with strings. Freed gladiators often remained bound to their patrons as clients, forever indebted for their liberty. Yet glimpses of defiance survive. A graffiti scroll in Herculaneum depicts a female fighter turning her back on a richly dressed man, her fist raised. Another inscription thanks a patron sarcastically for generously keeping 3/4 of my winnings. These fragments suggest that while patrons held the purse strings, they didn't always control the narrative. A skilled gladiatrix knew her value, and some, it seems, weren't afraid to remind their benefactors where the real talent lay. What's chilling is how little separated these ancient dynamics from modern ones. Today's athletes still navigate the minefield of sponsorships, where corporate backers demand control over image and earnings. The gladiator's patron may wear a suit instead of a toga, but the playbook remains eerily similar. Profit from talent, claim credit for success, and discard what's no longer useful. The difference: the women in the arena had no unions, no viral campaigns to rally public support. Their leverage was their skill, and the knowledge that, for all his wealth, even the most powerful Roman couldn't manufacture another fighter like her. In the end, the sand settled where it always did, on the patron's terms, but the cracks in their control are still visible, if you know where to look. In the defiant tilt of a fighter's chin on a fresco, in the sardonic graffiti scratched onto barracks walls, these women may have fought under another's banner, but they carved their own legends, one bruising, hard-won victory at a time. The bones don't lie. When archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a young woman in a London cemetery, her remains told a story no scroll could capture. Healed fractures crisscrossed her ribs, clean breaks mended with precision. Her collarbone bore the telltale ridge of a once shattered bone reset by skilled hands. These weren't the haphazard healings of a peasant or slave. This was the work of a physician, the kind reserved for gladiators whose survival meant profit. Science confirms what history tried to erase. These women weren't just thrown into the arena as novelties. They were investments, their bodies cared for with the same calculated diligence as a champion racehorse or prized sword. But healing came at a price. CT scans of another female gladiator's skull revealed microfractures along her jawline, the signature of repeated blunt force trauma, likely from training accidents or arena blows. Her vertebrae showed abnormal growths, evidence of years compensating for a damaged shoulder. These weren't the injuries of a few lucky survivors. They were the cost of doing business in a world where pain was currency. Every healed wound whispered the same truth. This woman fought through agony again and again because someone decided she was worth the expense. The most haunting clues lie in the teeth. Isotope analysis of dental enamel from gladiator graves near Ephesus revealed elevated levels of strontium, a mineral found in bone meal tonics prescribed to accelerate recovery. These women weren't just patched up. They were pumped full of ancient performance enhancers, their bodies pushed beyond natural limits. A femur recovered in York showed signs of rapid, forced healing. The bone thickened unnaturally where it had been repeatedly stressed. This wasn't medicine for comfort, it was repair work on a prized machine, ensuring it could return to the assembly line of combat. Yet for all the care lavished on their injuries, their endings were often brutal. One skeleton in Turkey's Gladiator cemetery displayed a healed spear wound to the thigh and an unhealed sword strike to the neck. She'd survived the arena once, only to meet her match the next time. Another woman's remains showed evidence of an infected leg fracture, likely left untreated when her fighting days were deemed over. The message was clear: their bodies mattered only as long as they could generate spectacle. What sets female gladiators apart isn't just their injuries, it's the patterns they reveal. Male fighters often show damage concentrated on their weapon arms and shield sides, their wounds mapping predictable combat styles. But women's injuries are more evenly distributed, suggesting they fought differently, perhaps more adaptively, using agility to compensate for lesser size. A pelvis fracture from Pompeii hints at a spectacular fall survived mid-match. A wrist bone from Gaul shows the unique stress marks of a net thrower's whip-fast motions. Their skeletons are blueprints of forgotten techniques, each fracture a footnote in a fighting manual we'll never read. The greatest revelation isn't in the bones themselves, but in where they're found. Unlike male gladiators often interred in mass graves, several female fighters were buried with honor coins on their eyes for the ferryman, fragments of finely crafted armor placed beside them. One grave in Germany even contained a delicate silver ring, its gemstone engraved with a trident. These weren't the burials of outcasts or afterthoughts, they were farewells to warriors who'd earned respect. Science may document their wounds, but these quiet gestures speak louder proof that for all the empire's attempts to erase them, some of these women carved legacies even Rome couldn't bury. Achilia, Amazonia, these names leap from the fragments of history, bold and unapologetic, but they are the exceptions, not the rule. For every woman whose name survives, there are countless others known only as the Thracian woman or the Syrian, their identities reduced to the lands they were taken from. The graffiti scrawled on a Pompeii wall praises one fighter simply as the Egyptian, her victories immortalized while her name vanishes like footprints in the sand. These labels aren't just descriptors, they're clues to a deeper story of displacement and resilience. Take the case of a gladiator grave in Rome's outskirts, where the epitaph reads, Nisha of Sarmatia, a region stretching across modern Ukraine and Russia. Her bones tell a parallel tale. Isotopes in her teeth reveal she grew up near the Black Sea, yet she died thousands of miles from home. Was she captured in one of Rome's northern wars? Sold into slavery as a child, the silence is deafening, but her stage name, Nisha, meaning victory, hints at a fierce reinvention. Like so many others, she may have shed her birth name along with her past, fashioning a new identity from the ashes of her old life. Foreign origins weren't just biographical details, they were tactical tools. Promoters knew exotic backstories sold tickets. A fighter billed as the Gaul or the Numidian became a living spectacle, her otherness heightening the drama. Yet this marketing came at a cost. For women already stripped of autonomy, these labels doubled as cages, reinforcing their status as outsiders in a society that prized Roman blood. A Greek inscription from Corinth mentions a woman called Libya, forced to fight in a reenactment of Rome's conquest of her homeland, her body literally weaponized as propaganda. But here's where the story twists. Some women turned their origins into armor. A mosaic in Spain depicts a dark-skinned fighter dubbed Charybdis, after the mythical sea monster. At first glance, it seems derogatory until you notice the crowd's awestruck faces. She'd taken a slur and forged it into a brand, her fighting style as relentless as the whirlpool she was named for. Others, like the Britannia recorded in a playbill from Lyon, may have leaned into regional stereotypes, fighting barefoot or with unique weapons to unsettle opponents and captivate audiences. Their foreignness, once a liability, became lethal strategy, the cruelest irony, the very thing that made them outsiders. Their accents, their features, their un-Roman names also made them unforgettable. While local fighters blurred together, these women stood out. A poem scrawled on a tavern wall in Ostia mocks a man for losing to the red-haired demon from the north, his humiliation sharpened by her foreignness. Even in defeat, she left a mark he couldn't erase. Yet for all their notoriety in life, death often erased their origins. A tombstone might proudly declare a man's hometown, but female gladiators were rarely granted the same dignity. Their graves, when marked at all, often list only their arena names or the ludus they belonged to. The woman who fought as Panthera in life might be buried as property of the house of Diodorus, her birthplace irrelevant to the ledger keepers tallying losses. What survives, though, are the whispers of resistance. A curse tablet found in Carthage invokes a gladiator named the Moorish Viper to hex a rival, proof that her heritage carried power, even in superstition. A child's wooden toy sword from London bears a crudely carved A for Achilia, suggesting some names outlived their owners, passing into legend. These fragments hint at a truth that unsettled Rome. You could take a woman from her land, but you couldn't strip the land from her. Every foreign-born fighter who stepped into the arena dragged her history behind her, not as chains but as a weapon, and in a society built on conquest that made her dangerous. The air in the gladiator barracks before a match was thick with incense and tension, as fighters made offerings to Mars, the god of war, and Nemesis, the spirit of retribution. Men would gather around altars smeared with animal blood, whispering prayers for victory or a quick death. But where were the women in these rituals? The answer lies in the shadows of history. Fragments of evidence suggest female gladiators may have carved out their own sacred spaces, bending tradition to fit their unprecedented roles. A recovered oil lamp from Capua shows a woman in gladiator garb kneeling before a shrine, not to Mars but to Diana, the huntress, a goddess associated with both ferocity and female autonomy. Was this a personal deviation or a pattern? Another clue comes from a small bronze statuette found near the Colosseum, depicting a fighter with a raised sword standing beside an altar draped in fabric, a detail typically reserved for priestesses, not warriors. These artifacts hint at a spiritual rebellion where women may have blended combat with feminine divinity, creating a hybrid form of worship as unorthodox as their profession. The stakes of these rituals weren't just symbolic. For enslaved fighters, a prayer might be their only moment of agency before facing the sand. A curse tablet discovered in Britain, inscribed with a woman's plea to the underworld gods for protection, bears the scratches of a hurried stylus, perhaps etched in the frantic hours before a match. Free women, meanwhile, might have used ceremonies to assert identity. A fresco in Pompeii's gladiator quarters shows a group of fighters sharing a meal, with one woman conspicuously apart, anointing a small figurine with oil. The scene suggests solitary devotion alongside communal rites, a balancing act between belonging and individuality. The radical nature of their participation can't be overstated. Roman religion was deeply gendered. Men presided over state cults, while women tended domestic shrines. For a woman to publicly invoke war gods would have been transgressive, even sacrilegious. Yet the arena itself was a liminal space where societal rules bent under the weight of spectacle. If a woman could wield a sword, why not a sacrificial knife? A graffiti carving in Austria jokes about a female fighter stealing Mars' favor from the boys, implying some did just that, usurping divine patronage alongside glory. What did spirituality offer these women? Perhaps comfort, but more likely a framework to make sense of their brutal reality. The story of the Greek warrior Princess Atalanta, often depicted on recovered armor fragments, might have resonated, a woman whose skill forced men to accept her. Or the cult of Bellona, the bloodthirsty war goddess whose priestesses slashed themselves in ecstatic rites. For gladiators living on the knife's edge, such myths could transform survival into sacred duty. The silence in the record speaks volumes. No Senate decrees survive banning women from religious observances. No moralist rants about corrupted rituals. Their exclusion wasn't legislated, it was assumed. Yet the archaeological crumbs, the amulets tucked into graves, the mismatched offerings at arena shrines tell a different story. These women didn't just fight against flesh and blood opponents. They battled for the right to kneel before the same gods, to claim the same divine favor as the men who shared their sand. And in a world where victory was fleeting, perhaps the gods were the only audience that ever saw them as equals. Retirement for a female gladiator was less like stepping off the sand and more like stepping into another kind of arena, one with fewer swords but just as many traps. The lucky ones who survived their final match faced a cruel paradox. The skills that kept them alive in combat were useless in civilian life. A woman who could disarm an opponent with a flick of her wrist had no training for the marketplace, no dowry for marriage, no legal standing to own property. The empire that cheered her victories offered no pension, no laurel crown of honorable discharge, just silence. For the enslaved, freedom might come with a victor's purse, but manumission papers didn't erase scars or fill bellies. Some faded into the urban underclass, their names lost to time. Archaeologists found one such woman's fate etched on a crumbling lead-cursed tablet in Pompeii. A former Mamillo turned laundry worker, begging the gods to punish a client who'd stolen her meager earnings. Her sword arm, once strong enough to split shields, now scrubbed tunics for copper coins. Others might return to the ludus as trainers, their expertise valuable, but their bodies broken. A recovered medical text from Roman Gaul describes treating a retired gladiatrix for chronic hip dislocations, her joints ruined by years of pivoting in heavy armor. Free women who'd volunteered faced different traps. High-born fighters like those in Nero's games might slink back to villas, their scars hidden beneath silk. But for lower-class survivors, marriage was a fraught prospect. Tomb inscriptions reveal a handful who married fellow gladiators, a rare love story from the barracks, but most faced suspicion. A first-century graffiti joke from Austria mocks a baker for wedding, the she-wolf who gutted 6 men, his friends questioning if he'd wake up with a dagger at his throat. Even in retirement, they couldn't escape their reputations. The darkest path continued service. Some evidence suggests a few women became Lanisti themselves, running small troops. A mosaic in Leptis Magna shows a woman in a commander's cloak overseeing drills, her face lined with old blade marks. Others may have turned to the only trade that valued their notoriety, prostitution. A brothel ledger from Ephesus lists a worker by the arena nickname, Chimera. Her fee tripled the others' proof that even in degradation, her legend held value. What's most haunting isn't the scarcity of their endings, but the pattern. Male gladiators who retired might open taverns, join the army, even become minor celebrities. Women, their options narrowed like a tightening net. Every fragment we have, the laundry worker's curse, the baker's taunt, the brothel's ledger, paints the same picture, a system that adored them as performers but discarded them as people. Yet in the cracks of history, defiance lingers. One tombstone near Cologne bears an image of an older woman holding a gladiator's helmet, not as a relic, but resting on her knee like she might don it again. The inscription reads, "She outlived them all. No husband's name, no children listed, just victory, stubborn and unshared. These women knew the arena never truly ended, it just changed shape." And the ones who survived didn't fade away, they carved their exits on their own terms, one stubborn breath at a time. A bronze fist gripping a broken sword rises 12 feet above the bustling streets of London, or at least it might soon. The proposed statue of a female gladiator, spearheaded by historians and activists, isn't just art, it's a rebellion against 2,000 years of selective memory. Unlike traditional monuments celebrating kings or generals, this figure wears no crown, claims no throne. Her power lies in her anonymity, a stand-in for every woman whose name was erased from the arena's ledger. But why does a hunk of metal in the 21st century matter? Because statues are more than tourist photo ops, they're battlefields where history's wars over narrative still rage. Consider the ripple effect of seeing a woman in armor where we've been conditioned to expect men. In Budapest, a temporary installation of a gladiatrix drew record crowds, not just for its craftsmanship, but for the visceral shock of encountering her in a public square. Visitors described feeling like they'd stumbled onto a secret, as if the statue had clawed its way up from some long-buried truth. That's the power of physical representation. It bypasses debates and textbooks to deliver a gut punch of recognition. You can argue with a history professor, but it's harder to dismiss a 7-foot-tall woman with a spear staring you down. The push for these monuments exposes a fascinating tension in how we memorialize the past. Ancient Rome littered its cities with statues of male gladiators, heroic, muscle-bound, frozen mid-victory. Yet the few surviving depictions of female fighters were often tucked away in private villas or brothels, their images controlled and contained. Today's activists are flipping that script, demanding these women occupy the same spaces once reserved for emperors. The proposed London site, near the ruins of the city's Roman amphitheater, where the statue wouldn't just commemorate history, it would confront it, forcing us to reconcile the sanitized myth with the messy reality. Critics dismiss these efforts as revisionism, but they're missing the point. History has always been revised just by the victors. The difference now is who's holding the chisel. When a sculptor in Naples recreated a female gladiator's face from a skull found in the city's arena, the local council initially rejected the display, calling it too speculative. Never mind that half the busts in museums are speculative reconstructions of male figures. The resistance isn't about accuracy, it's about who gets to claim space in our imagination. The most subversive aspect of these monuments isn't their gender, it's their honesty. Unlike the idealized male warriors of antiquity, modern gladiatrix statues often bear visible injuries, a bandaged arm, a scar cutting across a cheekbone. These details matter. They remind us these women weren't mythical Amazons, they were real people who bled, healed, and fought again. A design proposal for the London statue even includes a mosaic base mimicking the one in Bodrum, explicitly linking past and present. It's a direct challenge to the way history gets fragmented, inviting viewers to see these fighters not as outliers but as part of an unbroken, if often buried, lineage. What's at stake goes beyond correcting the record. Studies show children who see statues of women in dynamic roles, scientists, leaders, warriors, are more likely to envision broader possibilities for themselves. Imagine a girl tracing the statue's sword with her fingers, realizing combat wasn't always a boys' club, or a boy learning that strength isn't gendered. These monuments don't just honor the dead, they arm the living with a truer, fiercer sense of what's possible. The sand may have settled on the Colosseum's battles, but the war over memory is eternal. Every plaque erected, every statue unveiled, is a thumb pressed against the scale, weighing our collective past toward something closer to justice. The London Gladiatrix won't just stand on a pedestal, she'll stand on centuries of silenced stories, her shadow stretching across the omissions, daring us to look. The silencing of female gladiators isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint. A playbook still in use today, where marginalized voices vanish beneath layers of omission, distortion, or outright denial. Consider how long it took for Rosalind Franklin's role in discovering DNA structure to be acknowledged, or how the contributions of black mathematicians like Katherine Johnson were airbrushed from NASA's early space triumphs. The mechanisms are eerily familiar. Dismiss the evidence as anecdotal, frame the exceptions as outliers, then let time do the rest. But here's the difference. We're no longer relying on fragmented mosaics or chance inscriptions to piece together the truth. The tools to challenge these erasures are at our fingertips. Take the field of archaeology itself. For decades, researchers assumed warrior graves filled with swords and shields belonged to men, until advanced DNA testing proved otherwise. In Sweden, a 10th century burial long labeled a high-ranking warlord turned out to be a woman, her battlefield injuries preserved in her bones. Similar revelations have upended assumptions from the Mongolian steppes to the Andes, proving women's combat roles were far more widespread than textbooks allowed. Each discovery forces us to confront the same question. How many other graves, artifacts, and records have been mislabeled because they didn't fit the expected narrative? The parallels extend beyond academia. In Hollywood, scripts about female gladiators still gather dust while studios greenlight yet another male-centric sword and sandals epic. In sports commentary, women's achievements are often framed as firsts, despite historical precedents like ESPN hailing a modern boxer as pioneering, while ignoring the 18th century bare-knuckle champion Elizabeth Wilkinson. This isn't just forgetfulness, it's a systemic filtering of history through a lens that prioritizes certain stories and obscures others. Yet the recovery of these fighters' legacies offers a roadmap for resistance. When historians unearthed the Bodrum mosaic, they didn't just add a footnote to gladiator lore, they shattered the myth that combat was an exclusively male domain. Similarly, when indigenous scholars reclaim pre-colonial histories of warrior women like the Dahomey Amazons or the Apache warrior Lozan, they're not merely correcting the record. They're restoring cultural memory, proving that power wasn't always gendered the way colonial archives insisted. The lesson here isn't just about adding women to the historical roster. It's about questioning why they were removed in the first place. Who benefits when we believe innovation, courage, or leadership has always looked one way? Every time we accept a sanitized version of the past, we reinforce the hierarchies it served. But when we dig deeper, when we demand to know whose pottery shards were discarded as domestic clutter, or which inventors were denied patents due to race or gender, we expose the scaffolding that holds up these myths. What other stories lie buried? Maybe the answer isn't in grand monuments, but in the margins, the diary entries of enslaved women who led rebellions, the oral traditions of female healers branded as witches, the graffiti on factory walls from Rosie the Riveter's unnamed counterparts. The female gladiators' greatest legacy isn't just their reclaimed history, it's the reminder that absence isn't accidental. It's designed, and designs can be undone. So the next time someone claims women never did X or minorities, never participated in Y, remember the gladiatrix. Remember how her existence was mocked, then denied, then forgotten, until suddenly, irrefutably, it wasn't. The past isn't fixed, it's a battleground, and the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's the refusal to stop asking, who's missing from this picture? The sand may have settled, but the excavation is just